Hello and thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Sheen. I'm Stratfor's Senior Managing Editor, and with me today over Skype, we've got Eurasia Analyst Eugene Chausovsky to talk about Ukraine and Russia. So Eugene, right now, how would you describe relations between Kiev and Moscow?
In short, not very good. Right now, there's a lot of issues that both sides are actually moving farther apart on rather than getting closer together, whether it's the cutoff of electricity supplies from Ukraine to Crimea, whether it's trade talks between Ukraine, the EU, and Russia, which have not produced any significant results, or whether it's the broader implementation of the Minsk agreement. None of these things are seeing much progress, if any, and in general, ties are at a very low point.
So to look at some of those particular stresses in closer detail, let's look at Crimea, for instance. How has that really strained the relationship between the two countries?
A few weeks ago, there was a complete cutoff of all electricity supplies from Ukraine to Crimea, and there's been very, very little progress, although today Russia did announce that one of the four main lines had been resumed in terms of the electricity supply. But the reality is that that line was only resumed because it also partially supplied electricity to southern Ukraine. And there's been no progress on three of the four remaining lines. So right now, the Crimea is without most of its electricity imports from Ukraine. Russia is having to fast track some of its own energy projects to get electricity into Crimea. And in general, Crimea is not getting very much electricity from Ukraine at all.
So also we've seen, especially over the weekend, a breakdown in the ceasefire in the contact line between Ukraine and the pro-Russia separatists in the east of the country. How is this affecting the relationship, and how is it affecting the dynamic established by the Minsk agreement talks?
Well, I think it's actually a product of the political relationship rather than the other way around. Essentially, there's been almost no progress, if any, on the political aspects of Minsk, which means that what Russia has been looking for is greater autonomy for the separatist territories, for them to recognize them, meaning Kiev, to have recognition of these territories in terms of foreign and defense policy. But Ukraine has made it very clear that they won't be following through with any of that until Russia completely grants all access to the border between Russia and the separatist territories to Ukraine, which Russia has essentially said it's not willing to do until the political aspects are in play. So both sides are essentially in a standoff, and neither will move until the other one shows progress on each issue. So I think that is what's framing this uptick in violence in the line of contact between Ukrainian security forces and pro-Russian separatists, just as a reflection of the lack of progress on the political front.
And as well as putting direct pressure on the government in Kiev, we're also seeing other domestic internal pressures as well, often coming from groups such as Right Sector, who are, very strongly anti-Russian, aren't they?
That's right. And Right Sector was actually a major factor in the electricity supplies being cut off to Crimea, not only in the actual sabotage of the infrastructure itself, but in resuming supplies. It was Right Sector that was basically blocking Ukrainian officials and energy firms from restoring supplies. They eventually begrudgingly allowed the repair of one of the lines, but they said that they would still fight for a complete blockade of Crimea. So even if the Ukrainian government is in a position or wants to compromise with Russia, or at least on a tactical level show some signs of goodwill, Kiev is always going to be facing opposite pressures from groups like Right Sector.
Absolutely. And as well as the internal domestic pressures on Kiev and the external factors coming from the east, namely from Russia, there's an additional factor here coming from the west, namely input from other countries. US Vice President Joe Biden is in Kiev at the moment. How does that affect the relationship between Ukraine and Russia as well, Eugene?
Yeah, well, Russia is certainly watching that visit very closely. I know that Biden's visit is one that's meant to be a symbolic gesture on the part of the U.S. to show that Ukraine is supported still by the U.S. But he also brings a very strong message, which is that the U.S., just like Ukraine, will continue to push Russia on the complete implementation of the Minsk agreement, which means giving back control of that border, which means allowing OSCE monitors into the Donbass. And until that happens, the U.S. is not going to be lifting sanctions against Russia, which is obviously a very important interest for Moscow. And at the same time, There was reports about an extra $300 million in security assistance from the U.S. to Ukraine that Biden offered on this visit. There weren't any specific details on what such security assistance would entail, but certainly that's something that's going to ruffle feathers in Russia.
Very much so. Well, Eugene, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for now. But thank you for explaining some of these issues. And again, for more information on the situation in Ukraine, please continue to read stratfor.com.